Caleb Turner pushed open the wrong hospital door with a paper-wrapped bundle of sunflowers pressed against his chest. The room was cold enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. A machine gave off a soft, steady beep. On the bed, a woman lay still beneath white sheets, her face pale in the flat light. Her dark hair spread across the pillow. No flowers stood on the table, no cards, no coat over the chair by the window, no sign that anyone had come or planned to come. Caleb stopped breathing for a second. The flowers felt too bright in his hands, too alive for a room that quiet. He should have backed out at once. He should have found the right room and forgotten what he saw. Instead, he stepped closer, set the sunflowers beside the bed, and walked away without a sound. He did not know that one wrong door was about to open the part of his life he had kept locked for years. Caleb was not a man who drifted through life by chance. He kept his days tight and narrow. Work, home, his daughter, sleep. Then the same again. He had learned to live like that after his wife died 3 years earlier. It was not a happy life, but it was a safe one. Safe was what mattered. The hospital visit that afternoon had already felt like more than he wanted. A man he had gone to college with had texted him 2 days earlier and asked him to stop by after surgery. Caleb had almost said no. He hated hospitals. The smell alone could drag old memories up from the dark. But a promise was a promise, so after work he parked in the visitor lot, bought sunflowers from the grocery store near the entrance, and stepped into the building. The air inside smelled like bleach, plastic, and something sweet that turned his stomach. He checked the room number in his phone. 3rd floor, room 314. He took the elevator up, walked into a long, pale hallway, and turned left. The doors all looked the same. The lights hummed overhead. His boots made dull sounds against the polished floor. He counted the room numbers under his breath. 310. 312. Then the next door. He had gone in too fast. He knew that now. But in that moment, he just pushed it open with his shoulder and stepped inside. Then he saw her. Later, when he found his friend 2 doors farther down, Caleb acted normal. He asked about the surgery. He joked about hospital food. He stayed 20 minutes and left. But that quiet room followed him all the way home. That night, after he picked up his daughter from her neighbor's house, he made boxed macaroni and cheese and cut apple slices, while 8-year-old Sophie told him about school. She talked about a spelling quiz and a class hamster, and a girl who had cried at recess. Caleb nodded at the right times. He rinsed dishes. He checked her homework. He tucked her into bed. Then the house went still. He stood in the kitchen with one hand on the counter and thought of the empty chair by the window in that hospital room. He thought of the woman's pale face. He thought of those sunflowers sitting there alone. He told himself it meant nothing. 3 days later, he drove back to the hospital. He did not tell himself he was going to see her. He said he was only curious. He only wanted to know if someone had come, if the flowers had been thrown out, if the room looked less abandoned than it had before. He walked down the same hallway with his jaw tight and his shoulders stiff. When he passed the room, he glanced through the small glass window in the door. The sunflowers were still there, bent now, their yellow heads drooping toward the table. The woman was awake. She was staring at the ceiling, her face thinner than he remembered. One hand resting over the blanket, Caleb kept walking. He made it all the way to the elevator before he stopped. His thumb hovered over the button. Something moved inside him then, something he did not like because he knew it too well. It was not pity. He had spent years ignoring pity, from others and from himself. This was deeper. It felt too much like the nights after his wife's funeral, when Sophie had finally fallen asleep, and the house had gone so silent it felt dangerous. He remembered sitting at his kitchen table wishing, just once, that somebody would show up without being asked. He turned away from the elevator. This time he did not go into the room. He went to the nurse's station instead. A nurse with silver hair and kind eyes looked up from a computer as he approached. "Can I help you?" she asked. Caleb hesitated, then nodded toward the room. "The woman in 314. I just wanted to ask if she's doing all right." The nurse studied him for a moment. Maybe she was deciding whether he belonged there. Maybe she saw something tired in his face that made her soften. "Her name is Nora Bennett," she said gently. "She's been here a little over 2 weeks. Lymphoma. Treatment's helping, but it's been slow." Caleb swallowed. "Does she have family?" The nurse's eyes dropped for half a second before lifting again. "No visitors," she said. "Not once." He thanked her and left, but the answer stayed with him. That evening, after Sophie went to bed with a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, Caleb sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light above the stove. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He took out a scrap of paper and made a list. Not big things, small things. A book, a blanket, a plant that would not wilt in 3 days. A card, maybe, something with a picture on the front. The next afternoon, he brought a paperback novel he had read years ago and loved enough to keep. He handed it to the same nurse and asked if she would leave it by Nora's bed. She smiled but did not ask questions. The day after that, he brought a small green plant in a clay pot. Then a soft gray blanket. Then a blank card with a painting of a lake at sunrise. He never went into the room. He never wrote his name. He never stayed to see her reaction. He only left each item and walked back down the long hall with his hands in his pockets, feeling foolish and strangely lighter at the same time. 2 weeks passed. The nurses began to know him. One of them, Mrs. Grady, gave him a knowing smile every time he came in. Caleb did not ask whether Nora had said anything. He told himself it did not matter if she knew who had left the gifts. He only wanted her to feel less alone. But one Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Grady stopped him before he reached the elevator. "She's asking about you," she said. Caleb turned. "What?" "The woman in 314, Mrs. Grady said, folding her arms. "She wants to know who keeps leaving things on her table." His stomach tightened. He had not planned for that. He had not thought beyond the giving. "What did you tell her?" he asked. Mrs. Grady smiled a little. "That I didn't know your name, which is true. But she's stronger now. Sitting up, talking more. She notices things." Caleb looked down the hallway toward the closed door. The light from the windows fell across the floor in pale bars. He could hear a cart squeaking somewhere in the distance. "Why does it scare you so much?" Mrs. Grady asked softly. He let out a dry breath. Because this was no longer simple. Because he had a daughter waiting at home. Because he had built a careful life out of grief and routine, and meeting the woman in that room might tear a hole straight through it. "I don't know," he said. Mrs. Grady tilted her head toward the door. "She's awake." Caleb stood still for a long moment, then looked down at the small journal in his hand, the one he had brought that day. It had a dark blue cover and blank pages inside, something a person might use when they were trying to gather themselves back together. He started walking, slowly, like a man heading toward something he already knew would change him. At Nora's door, he stopped and looked through the glass. She was sitting up in bed with the paperback open in her lap. Her hair was pulled back now. She still looked pale, still thin. But there was life in her face this time. Real life. She turned a page, then lifted her eyes, almost as if she had felt him standing there. Their eyes met through the glass. For a second, neither of them moved. Then she gave him the smallest smile. Caleb's hand closed around the journal. He opened the door and stepped inside. Caleb stood just inside the room with the journal in his hands and the cold air pressing against his skin. Up close, Nora looked stronger than she had the first day, but only just. Her cheeks were still hollow. Her wrists looked delicate above the blanket. Still, her eyes were clear, and there was a steadiness in them that made him forget the monitor for a moment. "Hi," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant. Nora closed the book carefully and rested it on her lap. "Hi." For a second, neither of them said anything. The silence did not feel hostile. It felt careful, like both of them knew this moment mattered more than either wanted to admit. "You're the one," Nora said at last. "The flowers. The book. The blanket. Caleb gave a small nod. Yeah. She looked at him with quiet curiosity, not suspicion, not fear, just a woman trying to understand why a stranger would keep showing up at the edge of her life. I wasn't sure you were real, she said. I thought maybe the nurses were trying to cheer me up. He almost smiled. They seem kind enough to do that. Quote, they are. Her fingers brushed the book on her lap, but this felt different. Caleb stepped closer and held out the journal. I brought this today, in case you wanted something to write in. Nora took it carefully, like it was more fragile than it looked. She ran her thumb over the cover and lowered her eyes. I used to write all the time, she said softly, before this. Maybe you still can. She looked back up at him then, and the smile she gave him was small but real. Maybe. Caleb felt his chest tighten in a way he did not like. Too much feeling, too much risk. He had not come here for this. He had come to leave something behind and go home. He was better at leaving than staying. I should get going, he said. Nora's hand stilled on the journal. Will you come back? There it was. The question he had known was coming the moment he stepped inside. He thought of Sophie waiting at home. He thought of school lunches and laundry and bills on the kitchen counter. He thought of the careful walls he had built after his wife died, the ones that kept his life from spilling into anything unpredictable. Then he looked at Nora and saw how calmly she asked it, as if she was bracing herself for whatever answer came. Yeah, he said. I'll come back. The next afternoon he did. He found Nora sitting up again, this time with the journal open on the blanket and a pen in her hand. The late sun came through the blinds in narrow gold lines, cutting across the bed and the floor. The room still smelled like disinfectant and stale air, but it seemed less empty now. You came, she said. I said I would. He stayed near the door until she nodded toward the chair by her bed. You can sit, she said. I promise I'm not dangerous. Caleb let out a quiet breath that almost passed for a laugh and sat down. The chair felt too close at first, too personal, but after a minute, the closeness stopped feeling like a threat. Nora closed the journal. I started writing again. What about? She turned her face toward the window. Little things. The way the light changes in here. The sound of shoes in the hallway. Which nurse hums when she checks my chart? She gave a faint shrug. Things that remind me I'm still part of the world. Caleb nodded slowly. He understood that more than he wanted to. After his wife died, he had done something like that himself. Not writing, just noticing, counting the small parts of each day. The steam from a coffee mug. Sophie's shoes by the door. A single light left on in the house. Proof that time had not stopped, even when he wanted it to. They talked for half an hour that day. Nothing too deep, nothing that broke the surface, all at once. Nora asked what he did for work, and he told her he managed shipping and inventory at a supply warehouse on the edge of town. Do you like it? She asked. It pays the bills, he said. She smiled. That sounds like a no. He shrugged. It's honest. She told him she had worked from home before getting sick. Design work. Logos, websites, small projects for local businesses. Most of it came through referrals. Most of it happened at her kitchen table, with music playing in the background. That sounds nicer than warehouse dust, he said. It sounds nicer than chemo, too, she replied. The words were plain, but the truth behind them landed heavily between them. When Caleb left that afternoon, he sat in his truck for a full minute before starting the engine. He told himself he was only being decent. He told himself that was all. But deep down, he knew the truth had begun to shift. Over the next 2 weeks, he visited 4 more times. Each visit felt easier. Nora's color improved a little. Her voice grew stronger. She laughed more often, though she tired quickly. Some days they talked the whole time. Other days they sat in quiet, looking out the window while the machines breathed and beeped around them. Caleb found himself looking forward to those hours in a way that unsettled him. One afternoon, Nora watched him over the rim of a paper cup of broth and asked, "Why don't you ever talk about yourself?" Caleb glanced up. "I do." "No," she said gently. "You talk about work, the weather, Bad coffee, you don't talk about you. He looked down at his hands. They were rough from work, broad and plain, resting on his knees like they belonged to somebody simpler than he felt. There's not much to say. Nora tipped her head. I don't believe that. He should have changed the subject. He should have made a joke and moved on. That was what he usually did when people got too close. But Nora was looking at him with that same quiet steadiness, and he had the strange feeling she would see through any lie he tried to tell. I have a daughter, he said at last. Her name is Sophie. She's 8. Nora's whole expression softened. You're a dad. Yeah. A silence passed. Then she asked the next question carefully. Where's her mom? The answer hit him in the chest before it left his mouth. She died 3 years ago, he said. Cancer. Nora did not say she was sorry. She did not give him the kind of soft comfort that people offered when they had no idea what grief really was. She only looked at him with painful understanding. That's why you came back, she said, after you saw me here alone. Caleb swallowed and nodded once. He had not planned to say more, but now the words came anyway. I know what an empty house feels like, he said. I know what silence can do to a person. I guess when I walked into this room and saw nobody had been here. He stopped and looked away. It stayed with me. Nora's eyes filled, though her voice stayed steady. Thank you for not leaving it that way. Caleb let out a breath and stared at the floor tiles. Then Nora reached over and touched his hand. It was only for a second. Just warm fingers, light and careful. But it hit him harder than it should have. He looked up, and she had already pulled away, as if she knew exactly how close to the edge he lived. That evening, Caleb picked Sophie up from school and took her to the park before dinner. She raced for the swings, her braid bouncing behind her, then called for him to push her higher. He stood behind her with both hands on the chains, listening to her laugh as she kicked toward the sky. He should have felt grounded there. Instead, part of him was still in that hospital room, hearing Nora say thank you in a voice that carried far more than the words. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his phone near his hand. He thought about the next day, about whether he should go back so soon, about whether he was getting too involved. He did not like how much her face had begun to live in his mind. So he stayed away the next day. And the next. He told himself he was busy. That work had run long, that Sophie needed him, that hospitals were no place to build habits. But none of that was the real reason. The real reason was fear. Fear of wanting something again. Fear of stepping toward a person who might be taken from him. Fear of discovering that his heart had not gone as numb as he had tried to make it. On the 4th day, his phone rang while he was loading dishes into the sink. It was Mrs. Grady. He answered at once. She's asking for you, the older nurse said. Caleb gripped the counter. Is she all right? She noticed you stopped coming, Mrs. Grady said gently. I think she's worried. Caleb closed his eyes. For a moment, all he could hear was the running faucet and the old panic waking up in his chest. Then he opened his eyes and said, I'll be there tomorrow. And when he hung up, he stood alone in the kitchen, staring out at the dark yard, knowing with sudden certainty that whatever this had become, it was no longer something he could pretend did not matter. The next afternoon, Caleb walked back into St. Mercy Hospital with a paper bag of used books tucked under his arm. The winter air had left a chill in his jacket, but the second he stepped through the doors, the old hospital smell wrapped around him again. Bleach. Warm plastic. Coffee gone stale in paper cups. His boots sounded too loud on the floor as he made his way to Nora's room. She was sitting up when he entered, her hands folded over the blanket. For one hard second, he thought she looked angry. Then he saw what was really there. Relief. Hurt. Something softer than both. I thought you vanished, she said. Caleb set the bag on the table beside her bed. I'm sorry. Nora looked at the books, then back at him. You don't owe me anything. He pulled the chair closer and sat down. I know. The room went quiet. A cart rattled somewhere in the hall. The monitor beside her gave a soft beep, steady as a heartbeat. I got in my own head, he said at last. "That's the truth." Nora studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," quote. He let out a breath he had been holding since he parked the truck. "I wanted to come back." This time her smile was small, but warmer. Good. After that, they slipped into a rhythm that no longer felt borrowed. Caleb visited 3 times a week. Some days he came after work with tired shoulders and cold hands. Some days he came on Saturdays with coffee for himself and hot tea for Nora. They talked about everything that was safe before they slowly started talking about the things that were not. Nora told him about the life she had before the hospital. She had lived alone in a small apartment on the east side of town, near Maple Avenue, where the sidewalks cracked in the heat every summer. She had built a quiet career designing logos, signs, and websites for small businesses. She liked old records, tomato soup, and thunderstorms if she could watch them from indoors. "My life was small," she said one afternoon. Caleb looked at her. "Small isn't always bad." She turned the spoon in her cup. "No, but lonely is." He did not answer right away. He knew that kind of truth too well. Little by little, he told her more about himself. About how Sophie hated peas but loved pancakes. About how grief had turned his house into a place where no one laughed for months. About the guilt he carried, because no matter how hard he worked, he never felt like he was enough for his daughter. Nora never tried to fix him. She never filled silence with easy words. She just listened. That made Caleb tell the truth more than he meant to. One Thursday, Sophie came with him. He had put it off as long as he could, but children notice patterns. Sophie had started asking where he went after work on certain days and why he came home quieter than usual. He was tired of half answers. She walked into the hospital room holding his hand, her eyes wide as she took in the bed, the machines, the pale walls. Nora smiled at once, and the whole room changed with it. "You must be Sophie," Nora said. Sophie nodded and pressed closer to Caleb's side. "Your dad says you're the smartest girl in 3rd grade." Sophie's face brightened. "I got 100 on my spelling test." Quote, "That's impressive," Nora said. "I always mixed up the long words." Sophie laughed. It was a small sound, but it loosened something in Caleb's chest. Within 10 minutes, Sophie was sitting in the chair, swinging her feet and asking questions only a child would ask. "Does it hurt to stay in bed all day?" "Sometimes," Nora said. "Do the machines beep all night?" "Yes, and some of them are very rude about it." That made Sophie laugh again. When they left, she talked the whole drive home. "She is nice," Sophie said from the back seat. "Can we see her again?" Caleb kept his eyes on the road. Maybe. But he already knew the answer was yes. 2 weeks later, the doctors discharged Nora. The treatment had worked. Her scans looked clean. She would need follow-up appointments for a long time, but for now, she was in remission. Caleb helped her pack the few things she had gathered in the room. The books, the blanket, the little clay pot with the plant, and the dried sunflowers, which she had kept in a cup long after they had bent and faded. "You kept those?" he asked. Nora glanced at them and smiled. "They were the first proof I wasn't invisible." He looked away for a second after that. At the door, while a nurse finished paperwork, Caleb asked, "Do you have someone to stay with you?" Nora shook her head. "I'll manage." The words sat wrong in him. He imagined her walking into an empty apartment, setting down her hospital bag, and hearing no voice call out from the next room. He knew that kind of silence. He hated it for her. "You have my number," he said. "Call if you need anything." Nora nodded. "I know." Then she left with her bag over one shoulder and all that pale hospital light behind her. Caleb stood in the empty room after she was gone and stared at the bed. It felt like the end of something, and he found that he did not want it to end. He did not hear from her for 3 days. Then, one evening, while he was helping Sophie with homework at the kitchen table, his phone lit up. "Made it home. Thank you for everything." Caleb stared at the message longer than he should have. "Glad you're home. Let me know if you need anything." He thought that might be all, a kind chapter closing itself. But a week later, another message came. "Coffee tomorrow?" He answered yes before his fear could get there first. They met at a small cafe near Willow Street, not far from the hospital. Outside, the wind pushed dry leaves along the curb. Inside, the windows steamed faintly from the heat. Nora looked different in regular clothes, softer, healthier, more real somehow. She wore a loose brown sweater and had her hair tied back, and when she smiled at him across the table, the whole place felt warmer. They stayed for over an hour. Then they met again the next week. Then again. Soon, Nora came to Caleb's house for dinner. She stirred pasta on the stove while Sophie set the table with serious concentration. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and tomato sauce, and for the first time in years, Caleb's home did not feel like a place built around loss. Still, fear stayed close. It followed him when he watched Nora laugh with Sophie. It sat with him at night when the dishes were done, and the house had gone still. The more he cared, the more he remembered what it was to lose. One morning, Nora had a follow-up scan. The doctors had called it routine. Nothing unusual. But when Caleb texted that afternoon to ask how it went, there was no reply. He waited until evening. Then until the next morning. Still nothing. On the second night, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Grady. "Nora's back at the hospital," she said. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. What happened? They saw something on the scan. They're running more tests. He did not remember grabbing his keys. He only remembered the drive, the red lights, the way his pulse beat at the base of his throat. Nora was in a smaller room this time. No flowers, no sunlight, just dim walls and the low hum of air through a vent overhead. When she saw him, her face crumpled. "I thought it was over," she whispered. "I really thought it was over." Caleb crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed without thinking. He took her hand and held on. He did not have a speech ready, no brave words, no neat comfort. "I'm here," he said. "That's what I have." Tears slid down Nora's face. She tried to laugh once and failed. "You should leave before this gets worse," she said. "You still can." Caleb shook his head. "No, I'm serious." Her voice broke. "I could get sick again. I could become a burden." He leaned closer, his hand tightening around hers. "You don't get to decide for me what I can carry." Nora closed her eyes then, and Caleb stayed while she cried. The tests took 3 days. 3 long days of waiting, of doctors speaking carefully, of footsteps outside the door making both of them look up. Caleb came every day. One afternoon he brought Sophie, and she sat at the foot of Nora's bed drawing pictures with colored pencils while Caleb read aloud from a novel Nora liked. They did not talk about worst-case things. They just stayed. On the 3rd day, the doctor came in holding a file. Caleb stood up to step out, but Nora reached for his hand and would not let go. The doctor sat down. "The scan is clear," he said. For a moment, the room did not move. Then Nora let out a shaking breath, and Caleb felt his own lungs open for the first time in days. "It was scar tissue from the earlier treatment," the doctor went on. "It looked suspicious on the scan, but there is no new growth. You're still in remission." Nora nodded, tears in her eyes, too overwhelmed to speak. After the doctor left, she sat very still. Then anger flashed across her face so fast, it startled him. "I can't live like this," she said, waiting for the next thing, the next scare, the next bad phone call. Caleb understood. He had lived under that kind of shadow before. He had spent years waiting for life to hurt him again. "You live anyway," he said quietly. "That's all there is." Nora looked at him. "Is that what you did?" He gave a sad shake of his head. "No, I shut down. I stopped living for a long time." Her eyes softened. "And now?" Caleb looked at her hand in his. "Now I'm trying not to." She was discharged the next day. This time, Caleb drove her home. Her apartment was small and clean, full of books and potted plants and the quiet of a place that had held only one life for too long. He carried in her bag and set it by the couch. Nora stood in the middle of the room and wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she said. It was not dramatic, not desperate, just true. Caleb nodded. Then you won't be. They sat on the couch until dark, talking while the last light faded from the windows. Nora spoke about pride, about how she had let friendships drift because asking for help made her feel weak. Caleb spoke about the months after his wife died, about how he had built a life out of duty and called it healing when it was really only survival. At one point, Nora turned to him and said, "You're not alone anymore." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "Neither are you," he said. After that, their lives began to braid together. Sophie started calling Nora by name with easy affection. Nora kept crackers and fruit in her apartment for when Sophie came over. She bought her a sketchbook and taught her how to draw trees, barns, and faces with simple lines. Caleb found himself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching them with a feeling so tender it scared him. One Saturday, Sophie asked Nora to come to her school play. Nora looked at Caleb before answering, and he gave the smallest nod. At the play, Nora sat beside him in the school auditorium, her hands folded in her lap while children in crooked costumes ran across the stage. When Sophie appeared dressed as a pine tree, Nora clapped louder than anyone. Afterward, they went for ice cream, and Sophie talked the whole time while chocolate sprinkles stuck to her mouth. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Caleb sat on the porch steps and called Nora. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, I wanted to hear your voice," he said. There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "You saw me 3 hours ago." "I know." Silence settled between them, but it did not feel empty. Then Nora asked, very quietly, "What are we doing?" Caleb stared out at the dark street. A porch light burned across the road. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. "I don't know the perfect words," he said. "I just know I don't want this to stop." Nora's breath caught. "I'm scared." "Me too." "What if it comes back?" she whispered. "What if I get sick again and you're stuck with me?" Caleb closed his eyes. "Then I'm stuck with you," he said, "and I'll still want to be." She went very quiet after that. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. "I care about you." A lump rose in his throat. "I care about you, too." The next morning, she came to his house. She stood on the porch in a denim jacket, with her hands in her pockets and nerves all over her face. "I want to try," she said, "if you still do." Caleb smiled in a way he had not smiled in years. "I do." She stepped toward him and kissed him softly. It was careful at first, full of fear and hope and everything they did not know how to name. But when he kissed her back, something old and frozen inside him finally gave way. Over the next 6 months, they built something real. It was not perfect. Nora still had nights when fear kept her awake before a scan. Caleb still had moments when grief made him go silent and far away. But they learned not to hide those things. They talked, they stayed, they chose each other again and again. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Nora rested her head on Caleb's shoulder while an old movie played quietly in the living room. "I've been thinking about the future," she said. His heartbeat picked up. "That sounds serious." She sat up and looked at him. "I know this is fast," she said, "but I don't want to waste time pretending I don't know what I want." He waited. "I want you," she said. "I want Sophie. I want this life with both of you, whatever shape it takes, for however long I get." Caleb stared at her, his throat tight. "Are you asking me to marry you?" A smile broke through her nerves. "Maybe." He laughed then, a real laugh, warm and stunned. "It might be a little crazy." "Probably." He took her hand. "I don't care." They got married 3 months later in the backyard behind Caleb's house. It was a small wedding, nothing grand. A few close friends, Mrs. Grady from the hospital, Sophie in a yellow dress holding a bouquet of sunflowers almost as wide as her smile. Nora wore a simple white dress that moved softly in the evening breeze. Caleb wore the only suit he owned. The grass was still warm from the day, and the sky turned gold behind the fence as the ceremony began. When the officiant asked Caleb if he took Nora to be his wife, he answered yes without a second of hesitation. When Nora said yes, tears shone in her eyes. Sophie clapped so loudly that everybody laughed. After the ceremony, they ate cake from paper plates while music played low from a speaker on the porch. Children ran through the yard. Someone opened folding chairs. The sun dipped lower, laying long shadows across the grass. Nora leaned against Caleb's shoulder and watched Sophie lick frosting from her finger. "I never thought I'd get this," she said quietly. "Neither did I." She looked up at him. "Do you think it lasts?" Caleb turned and kissed her temple. "I think we keep choosing it. That's how it lasts." Quote. Nora smiled and he wrapped his arm around her. He did not know what the future would bring. He did not know if fear would ever leave them completely. He did not know whether they would get 50 years or 5. But he knew this much. Walking into the wrong hospital room had been the best mistake of his life. Because sometimes the wrong door leads to the right person. Sometimes a small kindness grows into the thing that saves you. Sometimes love is not about perfect timing or easy promises. Sometimes it is only this: staying when it would be simpler to go, holding on when fear says let go, opening your life to joy even when you know loss is real. Caleb had spent 3 years trying to avoid pain. Nora taught him that life was not about avoiding it. It was about finding someone worth the risk. Sophie came running across the yard then, out of breath and grinning. "Can we have more cake?" Nora laughed first. "Yes, absolutely." Caleb watched his daughter take Nora's hand and pull her toward the table. The sky behind them burned orange and pink. Voices drifted through the yard. Someone started another song. And in that ordinary, beautiful moment, Caleb felt something settle deep in his chest. Not certainty. Not a promise that nothing bad would ever happen again. Just the quiet, steady truth that he was alive. That he was no longer alone. And that love had found him in the last place he expected. He stood there a moment longer, watching his wife and his daughter laugh together under the fading light, and made a silent promise to keep showing up. To keep choosing this life. To keep walking through whatever doors were placed in front of him with his heart open, even when it scared him. Because hope was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to love anyway. If you believe stories still matter, go ahead and hit subscribe. Stories Beyond the Porch. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.